Strategic Innovation and Enterprise at the Australian Institute of Architects. For those of you who haven't met me, I've been in industry association for nearly all of my career and in the built environment. Some of you may know me from my time at Consult Australia or at the Design Futures Council. I won't spend too much time talking about myself today. We have 1 hour of action-packed information. So I'm going to move straight on to introducing our speaker. What I want to say first is I've invited Peter to speak today because we both share a passion for the business of architecture and seeing the future of our profession flourish. I'm going to introduce a bit about his background and then we'll get straight into the presentation. Please include any of your questions in the chat box, and at the end of the presentation, we'll go over them. Dr. Peter Raisbeck is a senior lecturer in architectural practice at the Melbourne School of Design, the University of Melbourne. He's also research director at the ACA. Peter writes a blog called Surviving the Design Studio. I have to say, I love the title, Peter, and I've read the content and I urge all of you to go across and read it. We can share that link in the chat box during the presentation. Today, Peter will talk about architecture as a global system in post-pandemic. He'll use a framework from his book, Architecture as Global System, Scavengers, Tribes, Warlords and Megafirms. And why I think this is important for us right now is very clearly because we're all in a very difficult situation. COVID has given a number of us, if not all of us, something that we never expected to be dealing with in our lives. And it's testing business models around the world, in our industry, in our city, and in our hometown. Peter's work presents a point of reflection, which examines the operating mode of architectural practices and provides a framework for leaders to assess a strategy. And I think right now we need to utilise any time that we have, which, as we're seeing the industry and the work slow down, to start to think about how we want to operate in the future. And I know that's on the agenda for many in the room today. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Peter. Thank you so much for presenting to us today, Peter.
Thank you so much, Alexia. I think the Institute of Architects is very lucky to have you with them because I know you have a very deep understanding of practice, and your work at Design Futures Council was incredibly insightful and cutting edge. So what I'd like to do today is talk to you a little bit about these issues of strategy and provoke you into thinking about that depending on your own perspective. So we're looking at this in terms of framed around my recent book, but I won't say too much about that, Architecture as a Global System Post-Pandemic. You can see the book there, Scavengers, Tribes, Warlords and Megafirms. And what I'm going to do today is take you through each of those particular categories, say a little bit about what I think about them and the challenges that those particular categories have going forward in this new post-pandemic age. So we'll talk about those practice models. We'll talk a little bit about strategy post-pandemic, and I think the first thing you need to know is that those particular categories come out of an institutional logics framework which examines the professional norms, practices and ecosystems of knowledge within architecture, and that emphasis in the book is very much in terms of examining architecture as knowledge production. So Scavengers, as we all know, small firms, and probably the hardest thing that you'll ever do in life, I think, is to run a small architectural practice. And scavenger firms are driven, I think, in many ways by a survivalist mentality. And I would argue that as gleaners or scavengers, these firms survive by finding, gathering together and utilising piecemeal resources of knowledge. And they don't often have within their practices elaborate or systematised knowledge systems. And the idea of the gleaner or scavenger moniker came from the Agnes Varda film, The Gleaners, if you've seen that. But scavengers in our industry do indeed constitute a lot of firms. Depending on how you look at which particular jurisdiction you begin to examine, I think in Australia it's about 70% or so of firms are less than 5 people. Generally across the globe, about 77% of firms in architecture have between 1 and 9 staff. But one of the real problems is that we don't have, even though these firms, or dare I say our firms, have, comprise many of the firms who operate in architecture in the global north as a global system, very little data has been collected at any level about them. I think scavenger firms are riven by conflict in some ways, particularly in relation to conflict, and the negotiation of conflict is prevalent in scavenger firm practice. Price competition is a constant thing that we need to battle with. Long lead times to gain sustainable revenue. Labour practices also related to underpayment relative to our education, long working hours, issues of diversity within the industry, and of course a labour structure within the industry, that is related to precarious employment. So as I say, starting a small practice or being in a small scavenger firm is probably one of the hardest things you do. One of the issues I think that we have in this part of the industry is that there's a culture of secrecy. We don't really know what's under the hood of these firms in terms of operating costs and money, and people do seem to be quite secretive about revealing those sorts of things, because I think, if I tell people what my profit margins are, or do a survey that indicates to people what my revenues are, then maybe I'm giving away some sort of secret source, or giving away some of my competitiveness. And I think that's generally the case across the industry. But I think this means that basic industry structure is opaque. We don't know what. Generally, we can't make conclusions about overall revenues, and it's really difficult to understand what is an adequate normative profit margin for a small firm in our industry, or any firm in our industry. So that thus makes benchmarking really difficult. If you're in a small firm, you can't really tell whether or not your revenues should be what they should be. You can't really tell whether or not your profit margins are what they should be. So there's really no reflexive mechanisms built into the industry to ascertain industry structure and, of course, industry competitiveness. So I think because of that, there are really many unknowns in relation to these firms. And I think at the moment, people are saying, well, is there going to be a wipeout? Will that be particularly the case in Victoria? Will we lose a lot of those firms? I think the other thing that I worry about is, and this is again an issue that we don't really know because of the lack of data, how many of these firms are integrated with their own personal finances, or whether there's some separation. Again, we don't know what profit margins are. Is it 5%, 10%, 15%, or 20%? What should it be in terms of us going forward? What are resilient benchmark revenues? Now, I think in terms of strategy, if it was me, and having been in small practice in the lean years of the mid-90s, I would never do that again. And I think if it was me, my strategy would be to join up with other people to become a diverse tribe, which is the next category that I'll be talking about. So I think there is safety in numbers. And I think post-pandemic, we might see more smaller firms becoming larger by joining up with other people, but becoming what I call in this particular take on practice and its industry structured tribes. So tribes are essentially firms that I argue are focused on their networks. They're generally bottom up in the way that they create design knowledge, and for the most part they are collaborative both with each other and also community orientated. They try and develop connections with their local communities or with the particular networks that they're involved with. So it's a different kind of thing to Scavenger, who's kind of sort of isolated in some extent, even though they might draw on their personal networks. I think tribes are sort of broader. So one of the tribes that I want to talk a little bit about in terms of collective practice is Assemble in the UK, as distinct. I think there's a Assemble development group in Australia. But I think the other really interesting and good thing about tribes, and it's great the AIA's got me in to talk, is notions around collective advocacy too. So they can sort of, tribes can operate at different levels. So I think it's really important for architects to not only think about collective practice and collaborative practice, as you'll see from the Assemble example, but I think it's also really important for architects to get together and develop good, better mechanisms for collective advocacy, either through the AIA and its various forums. Architects Lobby, I'm a big fan of, Architects Declare, and Parla, and I think Parla has done an amazing job of advocacy across our profession and really helped the profession to see itself in a different light. And of course the ACA, which is an employer group essentially, but of which I am research director. So in England, Assemble is quite a good example, and it's a group of about 15 to 30 people, I think. And it has a broad knowledge base, which includes architecture, architects, art, design, construction, and even people with backgrounds in philosophy. It had the aim of democratising architecture and to activate overlooked spaces through community focused programs. What is interesting about Assemble is that they describe themselves, for those of us who can remember Wu-Tang, they describe themselves as a kind of hip-hop collective like Wu-Tang, where all, and in that particular collective or sort of broader franchise of Wu-Tang, all the individuals could remain self-employed. And in the Assemble model, everyone works as a kind of freelancer and then comes together. What is really important, and I think quite interesting about Assemble, is that decision-making is governed by a model with different roles are split between HR, human resources, facilities, and finance. And indeed, capital flows or finance in Assemble is via a financial model where 50% of any money that comes in goes to the collective, and then 50% goes to the project team. And Assemble themselves state that as a result of this different model, they're constantly asking themselves the question, and they're constantly asking themselves recurrent questions. And, you know, this sort of internal discourse is focused on, is this the right system of the way that we're governing ourselves and making decisions, and who are we? So it's not the same as being a traditional architectural practice in that sense. So post-pandemic, I'm thinking that in terms of these kinds of collectives and tribes, that this is the way to go. I think certainly if I was a scavenger, I would be thinking about how I might join up with other people. If I was an architect who might be, I guess, downsized for whatever reason, I would be probably, and still wanting to continue in architecture, I'd be thinking about collective practice. And I think it offers us the opportunity as architects to explore and to develop new business models of practice. And I think business models are models of practice that are community and, I would argue, activist orientated. And I think that will give our profession more agency and worth. I think really importantly, though, in terms of strategy, I think what is really critical in these kinds of collective practices is that governance and inclusive decision making are really important. How you make decisions needs to be argued through and set out. How you govern yourself, if you're a group of 15 or 20 people, is really, really important. It cannot be ad hoc, and I think it needs to be done in a way that ensures equity and inclusiveness within your particular tribe that you might decide to start. Now, Warlords, we can always have a lot of fun with these in this overarching framework. Always good for a joke, as you'll see. And these are exemplified, I think, by the so-called star architects. These are the architects that tend to dominate national and global systems. And these firms create a knowledge ecosystem around themselves that might be dominated by a single style, perhaps even an aesthetic, an ideology, or a person. Patrick Schumacher springs to mind with his advocacy of parametric aesthetics, which is somehow sort of bound to his own being. And I think the other aspect of these particular architects is that they see their themselves as having a legacy in the traditional historical canon of architecture. There's often a sort of pedigree attached to them, kind of lineage as to where they were educated or whether they came from, and they see themselves as being, I think, you know, many of them talk about the idea of a discipline that is outside of what they might regard as the hurly-burly of normal or normative cut and thrust practice. I argue in the book about being like, and I think this is true, they're kind of like virtuous celebrity chefs, and these warlord architects reinforce, you know, and shape and constitute the sort of global system through the sort of various image practices. I was always been amused by an ethnographic study of Snow Header, which I came across at one point when I was doing research, is that a person, ethnographer, went to Snow Header and did a PhD for a couple of 2 years, a sort of anthropologist, and sort of came away and then theorised that the architects there, or the architect there that they followed around, was a kind of shaman or magician. And I thought that was pretty sort of amusing. And of course, you can see the way that warlords embody themselves or use social media and that sort of thing. Here's a picture of Bjark, of course, on the set of Game of Thrones, and branding and those sorts of things, and pumping out their image through media channels is really part of warlord practice. And I think 2017 Design Hot List, you got IKEA #1, which is, you know, basically how many hits and, you know, the data analytics from Design for that year. IKEA and Muji first, Peter Zumthor third, Bjark, there he is, 4. And of course, just above that other wonderful brand, the sort of horror brand, Donald Trump, John Pawson, 6, Zaha Hadid comes in at 7 with their brand, 8. Normie at 9 and Apple at 10. So it's really interesting. And I think in that particular year, Rem Koolhaas slipped from 11 to 16. So I think it's really interesting that these warlord architects are almost on a par. They, you know, it is about the brand. It is about how that brand is portrayed in social media. And when you look at things like that, you sort of wonder, what is the difference between their brands and those large corporate brands. And of course, there's, we have meme wars in relation to the warlords. One of my favourite Instagram people is Ryan Scavengers, who is constantly questioning some of these underlying assumptions. And he did this nice little mashup of Tinder when BR Bengals went to meet and try and get some work out of the Brazilian president, Bolsonaro. So post-pandemic, I think warlords, I would say, are they at all relevant? Do we really want to anoint these people as the people that we look up to? Are they just shamans and magicians? And I'm wondering if they're in fact a dying breed as we more adequately address this sort of historical canon or this lineage of modernist to parametric architecture. I mean, I also wonder whether or not these particular types of firms will be squeezed between tribes and the much larger firms. And here's a couple of warlords here in the mix, and I'm never going to be a warlord because I do not have the hair. And you can see on the left we have the one image of Patrick Schumacher as a sort of European urban, dare I say it, metrosexual, and then on the right Tom Wiscombe, who's a Californian architect with all that hair and seems to be wearing some kind of bathrobe come jacket. But I think if I was a warlord, I think I would be urging on them, or I would be saying, these types of firms, I think, need to adopt new forms of advocacy, and I certainly think that they need to adopt diversity. And I think whilst those two things might be counterintuitive to the way that they currently practice, I think it's also how they might survive and prosper going forward. Scavengers, tribes, warlords, and of course megafirms. And these are large multidisciplinary networked firms that work within the global system and often across various borders. And these firms are very good at integrating knowledge because they have the infrastructure and systems to do that. And they're good at governance because, systems and governance are seen as being key operational tasks within these firms. And these firms, I think, create highly specialised design knowledge and integrate this knowledge into their operational systems. But the primary aim of these firms is new markets and revenue and revenue growth. And the scale of these firms compared to the rest of the industry is massive. I think Gensler, a global firm, architectural firm, has revenues of over $1 billion. There's about 10 of these firms in the world, and combined their revenues would quite possibly be, in trying to think off the top of my head, maybe about 30, maybe $40 billion. So these firms are huge. AOCOM is, for example, they often talk a lot about integration, and they talk a lot about words that seem to evoke images of a balanced and integrated future. For example, AOCOM states in its annual report 2019, we believe passionately that those cities are positioned to excel in this time of global change are pursuing broad integrated strategies to tap hidden value, celebrate ecology and culture, attract people and investment, and overcome financial and operational efficiencies to define success. And you see this wonderful picture from their annual report of the little penguins, a bit of ecology, a nice tall skyscraper full of embodied carbon, and then some other, I think I could be rude and say, more schlocky developments. And I think in some ways I like to think about megafirms as being akin to Ron Heron's Walking City, which was a utopian vision of the 1960s, and the megafirms have kind of embodied some of that sensibility in a different way. You know, full of technology, traversing the globe, virtually unchallenged, and fascinated by the future and the idea of an entrepreneurial future. And for megafirms, these futures can be based on, you know, they see new geographies, basically new markets, new building types, new technology, and or indeed new modes of knowledge. I think in terms of megafirms, what can we say about them post-pandemic? I think they'll probably survive despite the global downturn and despite the obvious difficulties that are going to come in terms of cross-border projects and transactions. I think they'll probably take a hit to their revenues. I think the real question about these types of firms is, are they just the business as usual firms, or are they addressing real futures? And I think that's why I've got the IPCC graph there of global warming. Obviously, with any downturn in a global downturn in AEC economically, firms like this might go downstream. I'm not suggesting that one of these huge firms is going to turn up in your street and start bidding for the local school that you're trying to get. But certainly, I think for Warlords, they might start to eat away, and probably already have to an extent, some of those big, iconic, symbolic projects that Warlords love to get and are good at getting. And perhaps if I was a Warlord, my strategy might be to align myself with one of these bigger firms. And you can already see in terms of these firms that they're already jockeying around the future of post-pandemic cities, particularly in the area of workplace design. Now, my strategy, I think, is, you know, quite, I guess I wonder how ethical these firms are, and I guess that's why I wonder, are they just doing business as usual, or are they addressing the real future that we face? And I'm also wondering if these firms would be better off for our profession as a whole if they behave more like tribes. So maybe, you know, some notion of defragmentation and degrowth is what is needed in that sector, rather than a single-minded pursuit of revenue growth. So, kind of towards the end, I think post-pandemic, when you look at this particular framework that I've got, you can use it to rethink strategy. This is a good time to rethink strategy. I know that's particularly hard for people who are trying to survive and running around trying to reorganise their operations as they do so. I think it's a good time for architects to think about new and different business models rather than the old traditional models, less bounded models. I think, you know, of the single sole practitioner individual or the traditional full service architectural practice, I think we would be better off thinking about how we might develop business models that, or collective ways of doing our business that might involve other disciplines or other people, or might be have more connection to communities. But having said all that, I think in terms of strategy, knowledge management is critical. I really think we've all got to get away from this idea of the, you know, building, you know, the icon, physical icon mentality, and start to think about how we create and manage design knowledge within our firms. And I think the other issue is an intentional governance of decision making. If we opt to go to bigger models of firms, a sort of tribal model or more collective models of working together, how do we govern ourselves and how do we make decisions? And I think that is really important. And I think the old, the predominant mode of governance and decision making in many warlord firms, whatever size they are, is a single person, or you get the impression that a single person or a single architect is making decisions. And there are still firms around like that. Or on the other hand, you get large firms that have got, 15, 20, 30, 40 different directors, and everything's grown in a sort of ad hoc fashion. So I think post-pandemic, decision making is an intentional governance of decision making is really important. And I think as architects, we also have a real opportunity now to both at a professional level in terms of the groups, the collective advocacy groups that represent us, like AIA and ACA and others, to reposition and rebrand ourselves so that we can then increase our agency, which I think is the name of the game. So architecture is a global system. That's the book. There's quite a lot more in it than what I've given you today, quite a lot of detail. I think the audience for the book is for practitioners to see where they might position themselves, for strategists within various size firms who want to be provoked into thinking about strategies. So even though the book was written pre-COVID, I think it's still pretty relevant now. And also for people who from the outside who don't really understand how architects work, it's quite a good place to get into. It is not a business book. It is a book that draws on, and I think I've heard people say, oh, it's a bit of a practice book. I think it is a book that is more comprehensive than that. It starts off talking about controversies around the Venice Biennale, so it covers architectural history and theory. As a critique of, looks at technology and issues of technology in architectural firm. It draws on debates in advanced project management in relation to architects as well. The logics approach means that you can pick it up and read bits and bits, and of course I'm biased and I would say you need to buy it, and you should also have a look at my other books. So I think that's about it. And thank you so much. I think I've stopped the share.
Thank you, Peter. That was fantastic. A couple of points I'd like to pick up on that I really enjoyed in your presentation. Systems of decision making and governance in firms, a critical issue that I see in lots of firms. I couldn't tell you the amount of times I've seen people with no HR background in very large size firms making HR decisions. And of course, there's errors that are made. And same again when we look at things like business development, new growth, and strategic direction for the firm, new markets and sectors. I'll see very highly talented professionals that will have business development and marketing skills and very great analytical skills, and they're not invited to have a seat at the table when it comes to any governance or corporate strategy decisions. And I think that that's something that I'd urge a lot of firms to think about today, and just ongoing. It's something that I'm very passionate about working with the industry on, this one particular issue. I've got some questions that I've been lining up from the audience.
Yeah, sure. Can't wait. I'm ready.
They're pretty tame. I think you've actually covered a lot and you've got some pretty good ones. I'm happy with them so far. Where is the 50-50 team tribe ratio at Assemble coming from? If you could just explain that with a little bit more detail, that'd be great. Thank you.
I don't know how Assemble worked that out, 50-50. I'm not akin to their internal, I'm not knowledgeable about their internal finance. but in the material that I researched for the book, that is basically what they were saying. So 50% of it came into the collective, 50% of it then went to the project managers or the project people for each team. So what they do is when a project comes in, they all decide as a collective whether or not they should do that project. And if they decide to do that project, they then decide, okay, we'll do that project. And then they decide, they say to the collective, who wants to do this project? 2 people, for each project, 2 people within the collective do that. Now, it may be that over time, they have adapted that or changed that 50-50 ratio, but that's certainly what was reported.
I just want to continue when we look at the area of tribes. I had a question to add to that. I'm interested to know, with the tribe model, what is the typical entity structure? Sole traders, is that correct, Peter?
No. And look, that's a good question. But I think, I don't know why, but my view is this. I don't know why architects are hung up about what their company structure should be, whether it should be, sole trader, whether it should be company, whether it should be some sort of trust arrangement, or whether it should be some other, thing, listed company. I don't know. But for me, those are questions for your lawyer and your accountant. For me, what is more important is asking ourselves, what is our structure in terms of the way that we might make decisions? What is our structure in terms of the way that we're going to, recruit or employ or incentivize talent, for example, I think, as you just mentioned. So I think for me, those questions, they're like, when I talk about different models of practice, I'm not talking about whether or not, different types of legal entities or legal forms. I'm talking about these other things, which I think are actually more important.
Interesting you say that, and I think we've come full circle on the first point there. Often I see the ownership structure determining decisions or driving decisions and direction of the firm, and what you're talking about is a separation of the two. And that's a really important thing that I think a lot of people need to take from this presentation. There are different things that have different purpose, and it's about
I think
the purpose.
Sorry to talk over you. I think that's a really good point. I think in architecture there is this thing, and I know there are very experienced architects in the audience. I'd be interested to hear what they say. There is this thing, if you're an owner, you're a decider. But I think, in some ways, or if there are 5 owners or 10 owners, they're the deciders. But I think in some ways, that's, in an arena or in a global system where projects are increasingly more complex, where we are struggling to promote our value to, with competition from other people with other experts and other people with other expert knowledge. I'm not sure if that's really the way to go. I think a governance structure or decision-making structure that sets out, who decides what and, how it is decided, that might be more inclusive than not just include owners, is, I think, a better option, I would argue.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Oh, okay. Someone's put a thumbs up for that. Thank you.
I'm going to move on to a next question that we've got here from Lewis Dosting. What architectural business style produces the most interesting work? I think that's a great question. And I think maybe that refers to what we're just talking about.
That is a wonderful question. And I think that, I don't know. I think it probably depends what I have radical views about this. It probably depends what you mean by great work. is it work that is awarded through a peer internal peer award system that we might have commonly seems to predominate, or is great work something else? Is it something to do with ethics? Is it something to do with an aesthetics that stands outside of the traditional canon? So I think, you know, I'm a cynic, and you know, work has to be pretty good for me to think, oh, gee, that's pretty good. That looks good. So I think probably what I'm trying to say is we need to get away from these pre-existing notions of what great work is. I think architects would be better off if they scrapped the award systems and put that money into other kinds of advertising or marketing and promotion. I think that we've really got to stop thinking that warlords or star architects or iconic architecture is the be-all and end-all of our existence.
Thank you for that, Peter. I've got a question from Andrew Inglis. Thank you for the question, Andrew. Are megafirms the equals of digital Robert Barons? I love the explanation here, and it continues, one moment, aka Google, Amazon, practicing a form of design colonialism. You did touch on the answer in your presentation, but if you could expand, that'd be fantastic.
I think a short answer to that might be yes. What concerns me about the megafirms, and if you read the book, I mean, it's a short chapter on those particular firms, is that there is a rhetoric that surrounds them of doing good things and being nice to the earth and ecology and being nice to people. And, you know, there's a sort of rhetoric of care, and there's a rhetoric of ecological ethics. And I think the question that I wonder is, that's all good and good on them for, you know, pursuing or thinking that they're pursuing those things. But I'm wondering if it isn't just business as usual, and I'm wondering how much those large firms are really doing in terms of the way we're headed, particularly in relation to climate and global warming.
Thank you for that. I have a comment here from Stuart Tanner. Most smaller firms typically have a single director or perhaps two directors who take all the professional business risk. So therein lies the reason for top-down stewardship and decision-making, because the staff don't saddle the risks themselves. Do you have anything to say in response to that comment, Peter?
I think all I can say is that, yeah, that's, I mean, you know, we're about, small firms is about managing risk. And I think in viewing decisions about risk, I think certainly when I was in practice, I would try and have my own little ecosystem of risk management and decision making around me, which would include people who I thought would, you know, help me make decisions and manage risk. So I'm not sure that, you know, I mean, I can see where the question is coming from, but I think my view of practice, even small practice, is having a more a broader sense of or a broader approach to managing risk and gathering information to make decisions.
Yeah, what you summarise.
Probably all I'm saying. Yeah,
I agree. What you summarised there is.
Sorry to bumble along. But.
No. What you've summarised there is, while the end decision making does sit down to the directors of the firm, it is important to have a broader data collect to inform your decision making. And I think that you've explained the process that you've utilised in the past to have a wider assessment tool, utilising you know, key people with different perspectives and information than yourself.
Absolutely. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take on those different perspectives. But I think, you know, the leadership and decision-making theory is usually, you know, the broader perspectives you have and having counter perspectives and listening to those, it actually certainly enables you to make better decisions and manage risk better. And I think, you know, in those positions, you want to probably get 7 or 8 out of 10 decisions right. And you know, that's probably a good run rate. And I think architects do need to be better at thinking about these issues.
It's a good point you make, because I've always encouraged firms to speak openly about their business strategy. Talking about strategy will just help inform decisions that might help a competition potentially increase and their revenue or do better. But as far as I'm concerned, if all of the industry, if one of us rises and then we all rise together. So it's a different approach, but what I think it does, it allows people in small practice to be able to support one another with their decision making, which again will support the industry. I really encourage any open discourse along these lines to help our industry become stronger. I have a comment, a question here from Leon Eilick. Sorry, Leon, I don't know how to pronounce your surname there. Peter, do you see the tribe option as a permanent structure, or more of a project-by-project option for Scavengers to upsize and be able to be considered for larger projects? That is a valid strategy that's in the market.
Yeah, no, good question. So in the book, I do talk a bit about project networks, and I think there's one little section in there on that and how they're temporary and they might form and reform. So I think that is kind of one model, but I think for architects a more you know, the atomistic project network model, going from project to project and forming new teams from project to project is, I mean, I think my experience is probably it leads to precarious employment, that we're probably better off working together in sort of collectives in a sort of more stable, I guess, project or tribal network with common interests that then goes from project to project. So I hope that answers your question, but have a look at the book and see what I've said about that particular issue.
Thank you for that, Peter. Another question from Peter Smithdale. Oh, it's a comment. Architect means master builder. Perhaps we should not be called architects anymore. That's an interesting comment, and Peter and I actually had a conversation about that point yesterday afternoon and this morning, and maybe that's a signal for a follow-up presentation and something else that we can look at in the future. I know that it's on my mind. Stuart, I'm moving on to a comment from Stuart. Multifaceted knowledge should always be embraced with firm strategy. Ultimately, someone needs to navigate the ship, and typically that person is who takes all of the risk of the firm. If there is a downturn, the staff would still be paid legally, and they should be, but the directors would take a hit to balance things out and maintain fiscal momentum. Peter, do you have any comment on that in reply to Stuart?
Well, you know, sure, directors take the risk because they've got money in the firm, but that's not the same as saying that, you know, they should be the sole repository of decision making in terms of managing that risk. So I think, to reiterate the previous comments, I think you will manage your risk better if you think harder about the way that you make decisions and govern your firm.
Thank you for that. And I'm glad this keeps coming up. It's a common area of improvement I see in practices. And I think the strongest leaders are the ones that are open to looking at things in a different light and able to take in different perspectives without feeling pressured by them. I think it's important that we consume as much knowledge as possible to inform any decision we make throughout any stage of life. We've got a question from Fiona. Clients are becoming ever more risk averse and may consider the smart choice to be hiring mega firms with plenty of manpower or warlords who warrant publicity. How do tribes with seemingly lack of permanence and clear responsibility structures compete?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I'm not sure warlords are all that good at managing. You know, if you want the publicity, get a warlord, but you know, I think we've seen a few examples around town of that. Get a warlord, but then the risk management issues just blow up in your face. I think certainly mega firms do seem to be better at managing client risk, but maybe the outcome there is, you know, how suboptimal in some respects. You know, do we manage risk to the lowest common denominator where we don't push aesthetics, or we don't push community engagement, or the building is just ticking the boxes, or we can say we've managed the client's risk, yet we've built this huge structure that's burnt up half a rainforest full of carbon. So I think in some ways tribes, yeah, I think you're characterising my vision of what these particular forms might be as being a little bit more fluid than maybe what they could be. But I think one way to manage risk is to really know your community, to really know your users, to work closely with whoever it might be, contractors or other specialists. And I think that is where tribes, I think, have an opportunity to manage risk. And I think it goes back to the older days of saying, you know, make the decision where the information is. And I think that's where risk management really happens. And I think tribes have the opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Peter. I've got a
Thank
question.
you, Fiona.
They're good questions coming through. Thank you, everybody. I'm enjoying this conversation. I've got a question from Amanda Davis. Competitive tendering and firms being pitted against each other to secure work sets up the sparring of the tribal environment. Oh, we entered the race to the bottom. It's a conversation point. It was always coming. Do you feel that this form of securing work will be any different post-pandemic?
That's a great question, Amanda. And I think that post-pandemic, I think what architects need to do is we need to be more open about our benchmarking and our data between ourselves, so we know when we should not be bidding for something, you know, with low profit margins, or, you know, bidding for work that we can't service. Now, I think also at an advocacy and a policy level, I think architects have an opportunity post-pandemic to go to government, to go to, particularly in government, and probably a little bit harder with private industry, but to go to them and say, look, if you're going to spend stimulus or fiscal money in the economy on social housing, on schools, or, you know, new big projects, you know, you need us. You need designers. We are the best managers of risk in the construction industry. We're independent, and I really believe that. And I think that's what we need to be saying. At the end of the last GFC, they did the report on the BER program, and the people who really screwed that up in some ways, it wasn't the architects, it was the project managers. Now, if we have governments coming out of this pandemic and saying, well, you know, the most important thing is to, you know, speed up the economy and give all the tradies jobs and get some things going, I think, you know, that's not going to work if corners are cut, if design is put out of the mix, if, you know, particular procurement and decision-making practices go astray, you know, and we get pushed aside, because we'll end up with a lot of money spent on crap infrastructure. And then 5 years down the track, you know, we'll be in the same position. So I think, you know, for me, I think that advocacy at this point in time is really important.
Thank you, Peter. I just want to take a moment.
There was a bit of a rant, sorry.
No, we all have a rant every now and then. It's part and parcel with being in professional services, I think. I do want to say, which just to add on to your comment, this is something that Peter, I know, is passionate about. He's the research director at the ACA and is a critical part of my role. A number of you would have noticed that I'm new to the Australian Institute of Architects, and for those of you that have worked with me during the Design Futures Council, you know that I've worked with industry to put benchmarking tools together. So what does that mean for yourselves? That means that professionals like us can start to give back the information you need to make the decisions that are critical for steering your firms. I am going to put my email into the chat box, and I would urge all of you to contact me with the information that you would like to help you make decisions in the day-to-day practice of running your firm. This is something that I'm looking to develop some new research reports for the Institute, and I'm happy to take some feedback on there. And something that I know Peter and I are both passionate about is the conversation around participation in surveys. We can't do our roles unless you contribute. And I know that it's easy to get survey fatigue, particularly in COVID, but it provides us with the valuable data that we need to help everybody. We are getting close to 1 o'clock. So
I would agree with that, Alexia, because in a very fragmented industry where we have 75% of the industry are small practices, getting that survey data is really, really important.
And wherever possible, reading emails. It's easy to have
reading emails
logged in an inbox, but it's a one-to-many service that Peter and I are both offering, and through professional associations and through teaching. So that's a difficult, a really simple one that's quite important. I'm going to go through just 2 more questions, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up for today.
I know these are going to be the hardest questions, Alexia.
And I'm not filtering them. Okay, so.
Yeah.
This one I'm not quite sure I understand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it out and ask Paul to write the question again while we move on to the next one, and I'll circle back to it. So this is from Paul Jones. Paul, if you're there, it says, what's the vision and implications of a degrowth future for architects? Do you understand that, Peter, or should we ask for some more clarification?
Yeah, that was really less, that's a good question. I think, I think the big firms, the super mega firms, I'm thinking that, and I think, look, some of them are beginning to think or do research and beginning to understand that constant growth in the economies of the global north may not be the way to go. So they're beginning to think about degrowth, reusing assets longer, different mitigation and adaptation strategies in regards to carbon. And I think as a profession, we really need to think very hard about the way that we're doing things currently, is that helping or hindering the climate challenge. And at the moment, I'm writing, my next book is on architects and the climate emergency.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to our last question. Sorry, everybody. It's been great to see this conversation get happening. So the question is from Paul Jones. What's the vision implication? Oh, sorry. The question is from Brenton Rashid. Hi, Alexia and Peter. Thanks for this. Peter, wondering how do you see the process of succession planning being structured into the evolution of practice from an outset of it forming? That's a very good question. Thank you.
Well, I think probably the first thing I would say is have a succession plan. And the second thing that I would say, I mean, the problem with architectural practices is that they're not often traded. People don't buy and sell them, unlike other small businesses. So I think I'm thinking if we can strengthen the way that we do business internally, in more efficient ways, and thereby adding more value to our practices, then, you know, we can probably sell, you know, if we can get to the point where we begin to sell more practices. I think succession planning is probably, you know, for individual practices to decide how they do that. Probably relates to, I mean, I'm not a financial advisor, probably relates to issues around superannuation and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, you would probably want to spend 20 years in your practice growing it, growing its revenues, growing its profit margins, so you can either sell it at the end or hand it over to someone and get some money for that, or some, you know, get some of your equity for that and go off and retire to the south of France, you know. And that aspiration is not, I don't believe, should not be incompatible with doing great architecture.
Thank you. I think we're going to finish the session there. Thanks again for joining us, Peter, and thank you to everybody for your questions. I urge you to take a look at the book, buy a copy, have a read. Also, please go to Peter's blog, and you can contact him directly to continue the conversation. You have my email inside the chat. Please feel free to send me through any questions that you have around and to direction and data that would be useful for you to making decisions in your firm. See you later, everyone. Thank you.
And thanks, Alexia. And it's fabulous that you're at the AIA.
Thank you.
Okay, ciao.